Welcome to this GLP webinar on assessing trade flows through a telecoupling lens. Actually, I'm not, I'm sharing my screen. Great. Globally sharing land and its ecosystem functions through international trade. This is already the 5th webinar of our GLP telecoupling working group that I'm leading together with Cecilie Fries. And I'm Julie Zeringer from the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Bern in Switzerland. So today we have 2 speakers. I'm happy to say that we have a webinar with early career researchers today. So we have Nicolas Roux, who is a PhD candidate within the Coupled project at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, Austria. He will be presenting on from embodied area to embodied hemp, quantifying the pressure on ecosystem functions embodied in international trade of ecosystem risk commodities. And as the second speaker, we have Abdullah Shaikh from the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at Deakin University, Australia. Abdullah will present today on national level consumption-based and production-based utilization of the land system change planetary boundary. So we will first hear the 2 presentations and then have the 2 presenters asking a few questions to each other before we open up for the panel discussion. But please, if questions come up during the presentations, just put them in the chat already. And if there are questions of understanding, we might allow for those already directly after the presentations. Great, then I would like to invite our first speaker. Nicolas, you can start sharing the screen as soon as I stop and start your presentation.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, let me just share the screen. That's not the right one. That's the one. All right, so let's get straight in. So the theme of today is about sharing land and its ecosystem functions through international trade. So that's why I brought you a cake, because that's actually how we share. That's a symbol of sharing. And 3 questions: sharing with whom, sharing what, and sharing fairly. And actually, Abdullah will touch upon the last one in his presentation. The first one, sharing with whom. Well, as you know, we're not alone on this planet, and we have to share first with other species. Secondly, the part that is ours has to be shared among humans, either by splitting the land that is available or by trading what we get from the land. And then the second question is sharing what? Well, obviously, the first thing that we think of is sharing the surface area. You know, we humans, we use a lot of area. Actually, 70% of the global area is under human land use or affected by human land use. And then we would leave the rest or some other areas for other species. And we can share as well the hectares fairly among each other. There's only one hic with that, is that you see on the left, if we say let's share the land, I get the hectare on the left and you get the hectare on the right. I would say that's not quite fair, because 1 hectare is not always the same as another hectare. When we say that hectares are on a human land use, when that's human land use, and that as well is human land use. So 1 hectare under human land use is not equal another hectare under human land use. A complementary approach that can overcome a little bit these limitations is when we talk about sharing ecosystem functions, sharing what we get from land. One of those functions is the net primary production of vegetation. So plants and primary producers are getting energy from the sun to grow. And then this energy, which is called net primary production, it's as well carbon absorbed or biomass produced, depending on how you account for it, is used by other species and as along the trophic web. Primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers all rely on this big cake. That's our cake, the net primary production of the plants and primary producers. But there's another actor, that's us. Here we come, and we want some of that energy as well for us, and we need it for sure. The part that we get from this cake, we call it the human appropriation of net primary production, or the HANPP. And the idea behind that is that the more of that the cake that we take for us, the less energy we leave for other species. And if there's less energy available for other species, some of them are likely to go extinct because they will have less food or just less shelter, just less energy to live. That is called the energy availability hypothesis. Another effect of HANPP is that it is most likely reducing as well the carbon intake of vegetation, is affecting water cycle because of the evapotranspiration of plants, and it's increasing wind erosion, for example. But how do we human appropriate net primary production? I mean, I don't go out in the street and do that on a daily basis. I mean, somehow. So imagine that potentially, even where I sit, there would be a forest here in Vienna, potentially. And it would grow every year like this, having new branches or leaves, whatever. The first thing we do is we replace this forest by some other land use. And by doing this, what is grown in the potential is replaced by what is grown actually, the change being land use change, the difference. Some of it we use as harvest for us, the fruits, for example. And we're so nice that we do leave a little bit for other species, which they can feed on and go along the trophic chains. The difference between the potential in what we generously leave to others is the HANPP, the human appropriation of net primary production. So let's see at some numbers, look at some numbers. I told you sharing with other species, in 1986, we were appropriating 24% of the potential vegetation growth, while in 2013, we were appropriating 27%, leaving a little bit less to other species. And this increase was actually rather due to harvest more than to land use change, and more due to harvest, which shows the importance of looking at land use intensity as well, not only the extent. Sharing among humans, here you can see different world regions, how they consume which regions are consuming the net primary production. And when you don't look at per capita values, it's quite fairly distributed. Well, there was a period where the total global consumption was rather flat in the 80s, 90s, but this was mostly due to the fall of the Soviet Union, the green area. While afterwards, there's been again a sharp increase of the global human appropriation of net primary production, mostly due to population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, but as well changes in international trade, which rose from 10% to 16% of the total impact we had on net primary production. In the first paper, me and my colleagues, we looked at how these changes in international trade may have affected the global impact we have, the appropriation of net primary production. And we saw that actually in the 90s, beginning of the 90s, it seemed that changes in the origin of products through international trade did actually improve the situation a little bit, and it reduced our total appropriation of net primary production. But after the end of the 90s, it increased quite rapidly. So new changes in origins, new changes in international trade had a negative impact on ecosystems measured with hemp. It was not for all trade flows. You see that if the trade that happened within the regions that I showed before was rather beneficial, although the trade across the regions seemed to have harmed ecosystems, or at least increased the human appropriation of net primary production, mostly through more imports from the tropics. If you're interested in that, you may want to have a look at this first paper. But we still remained a little bit hungry with this analysis, because we saw that actually looking only at changes in origin was not fully explaining what is happening. So that's why we developed a new database on embodied hemp, which is at the product level and much more robust for different types of products and different types of consumption. And that is what we got. So I made this fancy Sankey, because in telecouplings, it's sort of what we have to do. They're beautiful and very tough to read sometimes. One surprising thing was, for example, the consumption of cattle meat in the United States, which seemed to have affected ecosystems a lot in Canada. That was a little bit new for me. It was one of the major flows between countries. And a more famous one, the Chinese consumption of pork meat, of pigs, which is affecting net primary production in Brazil. We love this story. It's on the Couple First website of China consuming pork meat that is produced in the EU, and the EU, to produce this pork meat, is actually importing feed from South America. And so I looked a little bit at this story, how the data supports that. And that is, it is true. We see in the middle, that's the animal products produced in the EU, and where they are exported. A little part is indeed exported to China, mostly indeed pig meat and dairy. But the bulk of the animal products produced in the EU are consumed in the EU, while quite a bit is as well exported to other countries. And it is true as well that part of the feed is coming from South America, Brazil, and Argentina. The green part is for soybeans. It's not very surprising. But here again, all of the bulk is still coming from the EU. So I would say it's a little bit a yes and no. It is true that there's this spillover story between South America, EU, and China, although we should not maybe say that that's the bulk of the data. But let's keep an eye on it. Just it's probably important for governance, and it might increase in the future. Not quite surprising as well, but still important to say, the increase since the late 90s that I showed before is very much linked. Oh, this is just for cropland. So hemp is cropland and grassland and in forest. But here we just look at cropland, and among the crops, it's mostly linked to increase of soybeans since the late 90s. Although there's quite some for other crops as well. Here the orange part, which includes palm oil, for example. And last but not least, I will show you one example which we can see in our new data, which is this consumption of pig meat in China. And we see that China, this is not only true for pig meat, but especially for that, had good efficiency gains in terms of hemp in the 90s. So hemp per ton of product, and in total in China decreased in the 90s. But then this got compensated by increasing imports since China entered the WTO in 2001, with more and more imports from South America and North America. In 2013, the footprint in terms of hemp of Chinese pork consumption was higher abroad than domestically, mostly in the countries I said. And just as a detail, this cannot be observed when we just look at area. And the data of embodied area, you would have seen that the bulk of Chinese footprint of pork consumption is domestic. And just as a bonus fact, which is not on this graph, but actually the pig consumption in China has now more impact on Brazilian hemp, on cropland, than Brazil's own consumption of pig meat. But well, might sound a lot, but we kind of know that Brazil is more a beef country, beef consuming country, than a pig country. So in the big picture, it's let's not over exaggerate it, but still it's a fact. I decided to put the methods at the end to not cut the story. So well, I calculated the human appropriation of net primary production first with classical approaches. You can see other papers, ancient papers like Grossman 2013 or Harbell 2007. It's based on FAO data, grazing gap methods, and feed requirements from Grossman. And then I get the potential vegetation growth and net primary production from vegetation models. We didn't run them themselves, we received the results and had to allocate this to products using different rasters of land use and of products of spam and FAO graded livestock. Here come as well some limitations already. Yeah, some of the rasters were, for example, only for 2010 and for 1 year. This doesn't really look good, but I had to use this one for all the years. That's not quite fancy. And we had to distribute as well then the hemp to the product. Sometimes some assumptions, some of them we had to distribute them proportionally according to number of heads of animals and the feed requirements and so on. So nothing is perfect. And then the bilateral trade data is as well based on FAO and corrected for re-exports using methods developed by Thomas Kastner, and with a little bit of change or the separation for feed and non-feed. At least this was so far not really done at the global level and at this product disaggregation. So some take-home messages. Yeah, I think it's quite complementary to look at land area, how we share land through area, and how we share the functions of land, like net primary production. We're still leaving less and less energy for other species, so which partly explains why species are going extinct, and mostly because of harvest now, more than land use change. So it's important to look at the intensity of land use. Trade, since the late 90s, is not doing quite a good job in reducing the pressure we put on ecosystems, measured with hemp. And with the new data, we could show a few stories, and the one that I showed you, like cattle meat consumption in the USA affecting hemp in Canada, Brazilian soybeans for pig consumption in China. And we can a little bit quantify those spillovers we're talking about of animal products exports from the EU to China affecting South America. Said it's not that big, but we should keep an eye on it because they're not quite governed properly nowadays. These kind of flows. And I think what I mostly want to say is that we have now this big database. It's in embodied biomass, it's in embodied area, it's in embodied hemp. As far as I know, is one of the highest product resolutions that exists. And it's so much data actually that I can't show and analyze it all by myself. So I'm happy to share it, to collaborate. I want to write this paper. It doesn't have to be the example I've shown now. So for the discussion, actually, I would like, this paper would be for you, basically. So please let me know, knowing what kind of data this is, what would you think would be interesting to summarize in the paper. Okay, that's all for me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Nico. We have one question in the chat already, but I suggest that we take this for the discussion after the presentations and move on directly to the next presentations. And the others, please also put your questions in the chat already as they come up. So I would give the word then directly to Abdullah for his presentation. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay, and I've also shared my screen. So I hope everyone can see that fine, my presentation. So hi everyone, once again, my name is Abdullah and I am a final year PhD student at Deakin University, Australia. I'm a part of Planetary Sustainability Science Lab. And today I will be talking about one of my papers that was on national level consumption-based and production-based utilization of the land system change planetary boundary. Very complementing to what Nicolas presented. So this paper was published in Ecological Indicators last year. So essentially what I worked on is on the planetary boundary concept. So for those who do not know, in 2009, scientists from Stockholm Resilience Center came up with this framework, a global framework that presented 9 essential Earth system processes, which is necessary for the resilience and sustainability of our Earth. Now, if humans exceed any of these, that means that risk the stability and resilience of our Earth system. My focus in this research is just on the land system change planetary boundary. And what I have done in this research is I have tried to allocate and downscale this global land system change planetary boundary to countries. And I've tried to assess how much of each country has utilized their boundary limits. So for example, if a country A gets a portion of land system change planetary boundary, how much of its cropland footprints, how much of it has utilized in terms of its cropland footprints, for example. So I'll tell you more about it in the next slides. So we have two perspectives in here. One is the consumption-based perspective, and the other is the production-based perspective. So most of the times we see in literature focusing on the consumption-based perspective, where, as Nicolas also have said, that let's say anything that is being consumed in China is of course sourced from different parts of the world. And essentially, China, since being the consumer, is responsible for the impacts happening elsewhere because of its either domestic production or through imports. However, there's another side to the story. That is the production-based perspective, which we also have to analyze because the physical impacts occur in the countries of production. So we need to also have a look at the production-based perspective. So whenever we talk about consumption-based perspective, we talk about it in terms of mainly population, because when it comes to consumption, we talk the number of mouths that we have to feed. So China has the highest consumption-based footprint in the world because of its population, right? Of course, there can be other factors as well, but population is one of the main factor. And let's say if we divide global resources equally and fairly, so we call it a fair share approach. However, if we talk about the production-based perspective, then we talk about the biophysical limits of countries. For example, how much food a country can produce. So if a country is producing food more than its limits, that means that it's putting a stress on its biophysical limits. It's putting a stress on its biodiversity. And as Nicolas has told us and explained, what happens when we get a lot from our land than expected. So the methodology that I followed in my research was that first I did the footprint analysis. I calculated the cropland footprints of countries, the consumption-based footprints, which consist of their direct, which is the domestic, and imported footprints. and also their production-based footprints, which consisted of their domestic and exported footprints. So I used a multi-regional input-output database to do these calculations. On the sidelines, I picked up the planetary boundary framework, and as I said, I only focused on the land system change planetary boundary. And within the land system change planetary boundary, I looked at the control variable of cropland, and I downscaled these boundaries based on fair share approach and biophysical approach. Now, as I explained, fair share approach corresponds to the consumption-based limit, and biophysical approach corresponds to a production-based limit. So there are two things going on side by side. One is the consumption-based limit, and the other is the production-based limit. So first, what we had to do was we had to define how much is the environmental limit for land system change planetary boundary, right, for cropland use. So there's we did intensive literature review. There are multiple estimates available in the literature. But based on our precautionary principle criteria and some modeling that we found conducive, we set environmental limits for cropland use, right? And once we had those environmental limits, we allocated those environmental limits to countries based on fair share approach and also based on biophysical approach. So fair share approach means that a country with high population will get a higher share in the planetary boundary. A country with less population will get less share in the planetary boundary, right? However, biophysical approach means that a country with large cropland area will get a higher share in the planetary boundary, because that country would have more responsibility to produce food for not for itself, for others as well. Likewise, a country with absolutely no cropland area will get maybe nothing in the planetary boundary, because that country has no responsibility to produce, right? So we calculated and allocated environmental limits to countries based on fair share principle and their biophysical approach. And then we assessed their footprints against those. So this is basically some of the snapshot of a few countries around the world. And this result is about the consumption-based result. So which is their consumption-based footprints against their fair share approach. So now if complementing Nicolas, if I focus on China, so these bars are telling us the footprints of China, and the blue color here, if you can see, is the domestic footprint, and the white color is the imports. And you can see with time, the imports of China is increasing. And the main reason why they're increasing is because of increased use of soy to feed pigs production and feed consumption in China. And if you see, China has a very high environmental limit as far as fair share is concerned because of its population, which is decreasing over time because its population proportion is decreasing with time as far as global population is concerned. So this way we calculated how much China utilized its environmental limit, right? So we can see that it's almost coming up to 100%. But if you look at other affluent countries, for example, Australia or United States down here, these countries have thrashed their consumption-based and fair share environmental limit. They are using far more than they should be using. And that is why, and of course, putting a stress on the Earth system because of their consumption. Now, if you look at the other side of the picture, which is the production-based environmental limits and the production-based perspective, now, of course, countries get the environmental limits based on the available cropland they have. Now, if we focus on Brazil, we know that Brazil has plenty of potentially available cropland. So that is why it gets a way more higher limit than, let's say, other countries of the world. And its production-based footprints are calculated as a sum of its domestic consumption and also exports. And we see that it is like the footprints are increasing, the boundary is decreasing, and this data is until 2011. And with the current trends of deforestation happening, I'm sure that this must have come very close. right? Similarly, we have data set for other countries, and we see that many countries are also exceeding their biophysical limits to produce food. Now, if you focus on Australia, Australia's cropland footprint, 75% are for exports. Australia is also called the food basket of the world, right? So the most of the cropland activities that are happening in Australia are for exports. And Australia is thrashing its environmental limits to produce food for the rest of the world. So what we have is here two perspectives: and environmental limits, a picture of how countries are using the environmental limits and utilizing it. So my paper has a detailed picture, but I just wanted to compare both perspective with specific countries. So if the left-hand side panel in this picture is the consumption-based environmental limits, where we see that most of the countries are in red. That means that they have exceeded their environmental limits. They are in their unsafe zone. Poor countries or high population countries, since they have more space in fair share environmental limit, are still within safe environmental limits, but the trend is not good at all. Likewise, if we look at the production-based perspective, countries with high cropland area are within safe limits. However, most of the countries also have exceeded their biophysical limits. They are encroaching upon the biodiversity and the space for their ecosystems to produce food for humans around the world. So the conclusion of my work is basically around Sustainable Development Goal 12, which talks about responsible consumption and production patterns. And basically, the principle requires countries to monitor both their domestic consumption and the impacts of their imports and exports. So when we downscale environmental limits, so in the literature, when we're talking about downscaling environmental limits, most of the times, or a lot of times, it's done based on population. But it's important to understand that we need to downscale environmental limits and allocate responsibility to countries based on the responsibility they have to feed the world, for example, if you're talking about in terms of cropland. So this is another perspective that we should be mindful of. And like there's this need to, whenever we talk about consumption-based and production-based perspective, it lets countries to better account their nationally agreed environmental targets. So for example, China is thrashing other countries' biophysical limits, let's say, to get food for pigs, for example, right? As Nicolas has also said. So responsibility lies where? Which country is responsible for damages happening elsewhere? So countries really need to rethink and better account their nationally agreed targets as well. And that all is important for global food security. So this was about my work. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. You can contact me later as well. And these are my details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdullah, for a second very clear and interesting presentation. And as we already have a number of questions in the chat, we would suggest that we proceed directly to these questions from the audience. They are mainly for Nico so far, so please, if you have questions for Abdullah, also put them in the chat. And then if we still have time towards the end, we can also have your cross-cutting questions from one presenter to the other. I hope that's okay.
Yep.
So Nico, did you see the questions in the chat, or should I read them out for you?
Yeah, I saw some of them. Yeah, tried to listen at the same time.
Okay, but then yeah, I'll read them out for you. So the first one is asking whether the increase in HANPP due to population is due to population growth or due to an increase in overconsumption.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's my supplementary slide number 1. I did this. We did this decomposition in the first paper. And here you see at the global level the different drivers. It was mainly population over the period that we saw, but this was greatly driven. I mean, changes in consumption per capita were low at the global level because of the fall of the Soviet Union. So this is a very particular time in history, 80s and 90s and late 80s. and beginning of the 90s. And then you see from the 2000s, overconsumption per capita is becoming big again. Changes in technology efficiency were not catching up with changing in upwards driving forces. And that's what I told you, like changes in origin at the global level were not super important compared to changes in what we consume. So that's why we wanted to look more at the product level. But this was not true actually for Europe. In Western Europe, the changes in origin were the largest driver over the period of the hemp, because Europe had already a big consumption, so it did not increase much more, but just the shift towards tropical regions, towards sourcing from tropical regions, was the main driver of human appropriation and primary production over the period.
Great, thanks. The next question would be, would it be possible from the data to calculate the share of meat consumption on hemp and how reduced meat consumption could reduce hemp?
Yes, yeah. It's that's one of the reasons we did this at the product level now. So if you see, that's only the main products. If you wanted to say it that way, on the left side, it's from the production base, on the right side from the consumption base. And if you see the colors, so light blue is pig, and then orange is poultry. Then you have the green ones, which are not animal products. And so this is absolutely possible. If you're interested in that, or a specific country, we can share the data and do it together.
Okay, there is one more question directly to you, Nico, and that would be, why do you think that trade might have reduced global hemp? What was the rationale behind your hypothesis, and what would be the way to go so that trade actually reduces hemp?
Yeah, thanks, Perrine, for this question. I think the main idea, the rationale was a sort of testing Ricardian misinterpretation of Ricardian theories for environmental approaches, where saying that if we trade and we import from countries that have less impact per amount of products, then we can reduce our pressure on nature, on ecosystems. So wanted to test this a little bit. So we found that it worked for some years, but not overall. I think the main message behind this is that in theory, why not? It could work that we source and import products from the countries that are less harmful somehow, like in terms of hemp or any environmental indicators. But it's not sort of a automatic byproduct of trade liberalization. It's if that would be what we want, we should make somehow laws or incentives or whatever, so that it actually is easier to import from countries where environmental conditions are better, or it should be the target, not hope that it's a side product of trade liberalization. I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, thanks.
For the regulation of trade, I think then we have to look at more behind each trade flow. There's companies and there's actors. So I think regulating the supply chains is as well very important, not only talking about the countries.
Great, thanks, Nico. I think I will take first one question directly to Abdullah before we go to a few questions that are relevant to both. So the question for you is, why are there differences at the country level in the extent of safe and unsafe zones over time? Referring to the two slides in the middle, you know which ones?
Yep. Thanks, Manan, for the great question. So essentially what happens is that the global environmental limit for cropland, for land system change planetary boundary has a range. So it has a best estimate, it has a safe limit and unsafe limit. So what we did was we took those ranges and we divided those ranges to each country based on their population. If you're talking about fair share approach, so let's say if you have 3 values and if you divide those 3 values for a country, so we'll have 3 values for this particular country as well. So that becomes the range of that country. And if you're talking about the production-based perspective, so we also take that range and divide by the range of potential available cropland area of that country. So that's why we have those zones for each countries as well. I hope that this answers the question.
Thank you. Then we can go to one more cross-cutting question. The person is saying that it seemed most of the impacts in Nicolas' talk, it seemed that most of the impacts come from developing countries, whereas in yours, Abdullah's, they come from developed countries, and that makes it really important to be clear what impacts we are measuring and what timelines are being adopted. So the person is wondering whether in Nicolas' case, the accounting for HANPP adds up both domestic and trade facilitated impacts and reports the total. Yes. Who wants to say something about that?
I can tell my parameters that I use. So my analysis or my calculations were based on the cropland impacts. So how much of a cropland was used in a country to produce food for domestic consumption and for exports. Yeah, Nicolas, can you, so my index or my indicators are cropland use. Nicolas, you can specify your indicators.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. And when that's the main difference between looking at area and looking at net primary production, or it could be any other sort of intensity indicator like stocks or biodiversity. It shifts the focus, right? When we look at net primary production, obviously the tropics in a very productive lands will become much more visible, and so that's why it probably shifts a little bit the focus towards, at least on the production side, towards the tropical countries. And although on the consumption side, maybe it's, I think consumption side, it's mostly from developed countries. That doesn't change the message on that. But it's absolutely important to state what indicator we're looking at and what this implies for the results. I really agree.
Good. Then we have another question to both. How do you expect your research may influence international trade policies or national production strategies? Or in other words, do you think your research will be read and used by policy and decision makers to reshape or adjust their production to be more sustainable? Who wants to go first? I guess you both have something to say about this.
Abdullah, you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for this question. Really good question, and it really rings bell for our policy and decision makers, actually. So the influence of our work depends on the importance of it, right, and the realization of it. I can't say like how much of my work will influence the actual policy and decision making, but like what I can say is that after working on this paper, I was contacted by people and they showed a lot of interest and they asked me the approaches that I used. And so I felt kind of good because like I was making an impact, be it small, but yeah. But let's say if we keep trying, maybe one day we'll get there.
Yeah, for my side, I think there's different messages that I want to convey a little bit to policymakers. the one when we talk about hemp, it's a little bit the idea behind this as well. This thing, although I don't really expect hemp to become a policy indicator because it's a little bit complex. It's a little bit more science oriented, I think. But still, for the messages, it gives, for example, messages like it's not only about forests. Like all ecosystems matter. They can be very productive grasslands that are as important as some forest or some shrublands or whatever. So that's the one thing it might avoid when we're talking those spillovers of going to the Cerrado, because it's not considered as a forest, and when there's only zero deforestation policies and so on. So enlarging a little bit the view on not forest but just all natural ecosystems. The other thing is, which I will attempt to work on from now on, is this spillover story. Although I showed you it's maybe not the bulk of the data, but I think it's a little bit of a loophole in governance, and I think that's quite important to say that when the EU is exporting animal products, it wants to export more to various countries, to Asian countries, to Japan, to China, and it sort of have this image of it's in the EU we have very good environmental regulation, but I think shedding light on the fact that there's part of it that actually comes from tropical regions and that is affecting ecosystems there is policy relevant as well. Maybe I can follow up with a question to Abdullah if I can, because
yes,
it's related to that one.
Yeah, there's also a comment in the chat that says that HANPP is actually one of the proposed indicators in this CBD post-2020 framework.
Okay.
Just to mention this. Yes, but please go ahead with your follow-up question to Abdullah.
Yeah, just following what you said, if you were to go, you said you want countries to account both the consumption and production side, and I'm very much in favor of that. And are you confident enough to say our approaches and accounts to make consumption-based accounts are robust so that you can set policy targets exactly the same as the production-based that are used now, and that these would be somehow legally binding or whatever? Are you confident enough to actually make this claim? If yes, great. And if not, what is still needed to have this sort of very international standard to make a policy?
Yeah, thanks, Nico. Look, the thing is, the global accounting is like, for example, if you look at the other side of the picture, if you look at environmental footprint accounting, we see that a lot of European countries, they claim to be very environmental efficient, right? However, the sad side of the story is that most of the impacts are occurring in other countries, particularly in developing countries, right? So it's a sad story that a lot of countries only consider their domestic impacts, not the impacts they are causing elsewhere. And I think the things are changing. I read somewhere in the news that that the Sustainable Development Goal accounting and targets will be considering this somehow, especially for greenhouse gas emissions. And I think things are changing, and as the realization is increasing, things will change in future. But yeah, rich, affluent countries, they have more say in global policy and decision making, sadly. And yeah, but I think the fair approach is that countries should be held accountable for their impacts, not only on their own land but elsewhere as well. Yeah, so we should look at both sides of the picture, yeah, in global policy and decision making.
Good. If there are no follow-up questions on this point, then we would still have one more, a bit more methodological question probably for Nicolas. And this would be on whether you've seen data on water consumption relating to land data.
I'm not expert. I mean, there is a lot of embodied green water, blue water, gray water studies. Although it's not my field, or it's not my comfort zone. I'm sure you'll find some, but I can't really answer more.
I
Good.
have one question for
Yes.
Nicolas, if you have time.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Nicolas, so in the start of your presentation, you mentioned the amount of land humans are using, amount of habitable land the humans are using, and we are leaving land for nature. So do you think there is this accounting for, like, how much of land should we leave for nature for them to sustainably thrive? Is there any accounting that you are aware of, or is there a way that we can account that? Because I know that there are theories from Edward Wilson's half Earth theory, leaving 50% of land for nature, 50% of land for humans. But are there any other concrete theories or scientific methods to do that?
I think if we're talking about area and conservation, like really leaving area for land, I would leave the word to see you, who's somewhere in the group, because she's expert on that. And I will just say, because I'm biased on what I'm doing, is that I'm looking less at area rather than at NPP, and I think the question of the boundary, even for NPP, is very, very difficult, although there's some work on that as well. So I told you we are more or less consuming now 27% of the potential MPP. It's 32 in terms of only what is growing above ground, and so that means that it's, the land that we are using, we're not completely destroying the vegetation that is on there. We're not at the 70% of the other figure, which is an important thing to say as well, that if we use a hectare but we just use a little bit, there's just one cow going there every 3 years to graze some, I mean, it's much less of an impact. And where to set the boundary, I don't know, actually. I don't. I have a colleague, they use they have a number, I think, of a certain percentage, but I don't remember the exact name. We should maybe there's some tipping points of, that would be a great thing to look at, actually, which tipping points are related to net primary production. Actually, I'll write that down. That's
great.
So
Thanks.
you want
Thanks for
to
the
talk
answer.
about the area, or
I didn't see you in the audience.
really?
If she's here, she can speak up, but I don't think so.
Okay, maybe I should. Guys.
Yeah. Do you have any more questions to each other, or is there any other question from the audience at this point?
I'm all good.
I mean, otherwise I would have maybe one last question, which is also for Nico. And you said that harvest is more important than land use change. That came out of your analysis. So what would that mean then in terms of reducing the negative impacts of trade on the environment? It's just a bit more difficult for me to imagine what can be done than in terms of land use change.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I just didn't give enough thought of it, and maybe my wording of more important was not right. I'm not saying that it's really more important to harvest less, or that we can make a lot of deforestation as long as we don't harvest a lot. I mean, that's not my point, but I'm saying that increase in harvest have as well been a big driver of the pressure on ecosystems of the past, and I think this fully joins a sort of land sharing, land sparing debate. So any answer to that debate would probably answer your question of if we use lot of land, but sort of share it and use it in a way, agroforestry and whatsoever, that still don't have too much harvest on it. I'm not so set on the land sharing debate. I don't have a clear-cut answer to that, but I think that's the discussion that actually leads to an answer. So that's maybe a little bit disappointing as an answer.
No, that's fine. I think there is no clear-cut answer to this probably. So thanks a lot. And I think with this, we are coming to the end of this webinar. Thanks so much to our two speakers for really interesting insights on telecoupling in the larger sense. And Cecilia has put the link to our working group in the chat. So if you'd like to become a member, please sign up. You will receive newsletters with information about telecoupling papers coming out, jobs, adverts, etc. And then I would also like to thank Abdullah especially for this initiative for this webinar, because he actually reached out to us and suggested to organize a webinar on this. So we also welcome suggestions for future webinars. If you would like to be a speaker in one, just send us an email and then we can think about organizing a webinar in our series. So yeah, thanks so much also to our audience for a really engaged discussion. I think it was great. And as we said in the beginning, the recording and also the slides will be available on the GLP website soon. All right, thanks so much. Enjoy your weekend when you get to it, and till next time, I hope. Bye.
Bye, thanks.